The village of High Meadow prided itself on three things: its immaculate hedgerows, its annual summer fete, and its unwavering belief that nothing truly dreadful ever happened within its borders. Nestled among gentle hills and golden meadows, the town appeared on postcards and travel pamphlets as the very picture of English serenity, a place where the loudest disturbance was usually Mrs. Pendleton's ancient terrier barking at passing bicycles. Thus, on the bright Saturday morning when the villagers gathered on the green for the fete, no one imagined that by afternoon they would be whispering in horrified tones, clutching their baskets and glancing nervously over their shoulders as though the devil himself had come for a promenade. Miss Marple, visiting her distant cousin, Mrs. Agatha Fanshawe, for the weekend, had arrived early to help with the jam judging. She sat beneath a striped canvas tent, knitting placidly while Mrs. Fanshawe inspected jars of raspberry preserves with the solemnity of a monarch reviewing troops. "It's always the same," Mrs. Fanshawe muttered, lifting a jar to the light. "Mrs. Copley adds too much sugar, Mrs. Troughton too little, and Mrs. Bowditch insists on including a splash of sherry she claims evaporates in the boil. I can taste every drop." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps variety is half the pleasure." "Variety," Mrs. Fanshawe sniffed, "has its place, but proper jam is proper jam." Still, she softened a moment later, patting Miss Marple's hand. "You mustn't think High Meadow is entirely inflexible, Jane. We simply like things done as they ought to be done." Miss Marple, who had witnessed many an evil deed sprout beneath the soil of places where things were done precisely as they ought, merely nodded. Across the green, children shrieked with laughter near the pony rides, and a brass band played valiantly, despite being perpetually out of tune. At the far end of the grounds, the High Meadow Ladies' Association had erected a display called A Journey Through Time. It featured small historical tableaus, Victorian schoolrooms, medieval bakers, and, most curiously, a set titled Candles Through the Ages. In it, an elegantly carved beeswax candle, encased in a silver holder, burned steadily under a glass dome. Or rather, it should have burned steadily. Instead, as several passers-by had commented with bemused delight, the candle seemed to burn backwards. Every few minutes, the flame grew brighter without diminishing the wax at all. It was a clever trick, the villagers agreed, though no one could say precisely how it was managed. But the odd candle was forgotten when a shrill cry tore through the warm afternoon. A young maid, Amy Rowntree, trembling and pale, stumbled from the tent where the Ladies' Association stored their supplies. One hand clutched a crumpled apron to her mouth, the other pointed behind her in mute horror. Mrs. Fanshawe, Miss Marple, and half the village hurried toward her. Inside the tent, lying slumped across a table covered in catalogues and linen samples, was Mrs. Henrietta Harrow, chairwoman of the Fete Committee and widely considered the most formidable woman in High Meadow. Her spectacles were askew. One hand dangled limply toward the ground. And at the center of her immaculate blouse was a spreading blot of dark, sticky crimson. A knife, ornate, antique, silver-handled, protruded from just below her sternum. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by the inevitable chorus of speculation. Good heavens! Murder! No, surely an accident. She must have fallen on it. Who would do such a thing? Miss Marple stepped closer, her expression mild, but her eyes very sharp. She noted the angle of the body, the carefully arranged papers beneath Mrs. Harrow's cheek, the curious absence of any overturned objects. Nothing appeared disturbed, nothing except Mrs. Harrow herself. Mrs. Fanshawe clutched her cousin's arm. "Jane, this is dreadful, absolutely dreadful, but surely it must have been a robbery gone wrong. Henrietta wore that diamond brooch of hers today." Miss Marple leaned slightly toward the body, though she did not touch it. "Her brooch is still in place, dear," she murmured. Indeed, the brooch glittered coldly in the filtered sunlight, undisturbed. By now, Inspector Bramwell of the High Meadow Constabulary had arrived, perspiring heavily despite the pleasant weather. He brushed past the onlookers, barking for space. "No one is to leave the grounds," he announced. "This is an active investigation. I'll need statements from everyone." That declaration, predictably, sent a ripple of fear and excitement through the crowd. High Meadows residents had always believed a murder could never happen in their peaceful village. Now that it had, the prospect of being part of the drama was both horrifying and irresistibly fascinating. As Bramwell crouched over the body, muttering to his sergeant, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to something far more subtle. A faint smear of wax on the edge of Mrs. Harrow's sleeve. Pale yellow, glossy in the light. Yet, there was no candle anywhere in the tent. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back across the green, toward the Ladies' Association display, toward the candle under glass, burning in that strange, impossible way. "Jane?" Mrs. Fanshawe whispered. "What is it?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said softly, returning to her knitting with a serene expression. "Only, human nature does have a way of repeating itself, you know. One sees the same sorts of patterns." She did not elaborate. It was far too soon for that. For now, the crowd was buzzing, Bramwell was muttering about suspects, and the fete, once a picture of cheerful order, had dissolved into chaos. High Meadow, with its neat gardens and polite smiles, had revealed a darker undercurrent, one Miss Marple knew all too well. Someone among these villagers had killed Henrietta Harrow, and someone, she suspected, understood the strange candle better than they wished others to know. The fate did not so much conclude as unravel. Stalls were hastily abandoned, the brass band faltered into silence, and the smell of frying scones and trampled grass mingled oddly with the copper tang of fear that no one could quite name. Mothers collected their children with fluttering hands. The pony, sensing unease, tossed its head and needed 2 boys to calm it. Inspector Bramwell had Mrs. Harrow's tent cordoned off with the help of a length of bunting and a very self-important constable who shooed people away as though defending the crown jewels. "Right, that's enough gawking," Bramwell declared, his voice booming across the green. "There's been a tragic incident." "Murder, you mean?" called out Mrs. Pendleton, who always liked things termed plainly, especially when they weren't happening to her. Bramwell shot her a sharp look. "An incident," he repeated firmly, "and until we know precisely what's occurred, no one is to leave. We'll be taking statements in the village hall. Go along now, all of you. Quietly." No one went quietly. They moved in a churning mass of whispers, speculation bubbling like a kettle left unwatched. "I heard she'd argued with someone this morning," murmured Mrs. Copley to her friend. "Not someone, Lydia Copley, it was you," said her friend with relish. "About the placard placements, wasn't it? She made you move your stall." "Well, if you think I'd stab a woman over a placard." "I don't say you would, but you must admit it makes for a very interesting start," the friend said, already storing away the detail like a squirrel with a nut. Miss Marple and Mrs. Fanshawe found themselves drawn into the slow-moving river of bodies heading towards the hall. Mrs. Fanshawe's cheeks were splotched with agitation. "I can't believe this," she kept repeating. "In High Meadow, of all places. Henrietta, of all people. She was so healthy, so decided." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Very decided. People often resent that quality, I've noticed." Mrs. Fanshawe blinked. "Resent? Oh, I don't know about that. Henrietta could be a little forceful, perhaps, but it was for everyone's good." "Of course, dear." They passed by the candles through the ages display. The green had emptied enough that Miss Marple could see it clearly now, the silver candlestick under the glass dome, the stalwart flame glowing without the faintest sign of guttering. A young man in a tweed jacket stood nearby, frowning at the exhibit with a kind of proprietary distress. He was tall, with unruly hair and spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose. "This is ghastly," he muttered to the woman beside him. "I told them we oughtn't use anything valuable. Now there's been a death and people will talk about curses and so on." "Don't be melodramatic, Julian," the woman replied. She was strikingly handsome in a severe way, with a straight back and a mouth that looked as though it preferred reprimands to smiles. "The candle is insured, and the Harrows have faced worse than a little gossip." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. So the candle belonged to the Harrows, or had some connection to them. She tucked the information away, as neatly as she wound her ball of wool. Inside the village hall, Bramwell installed himself at a trestle table with his notebook, the sergeant at his side. The villagers arranged themselves on hard chairs, fanning their faces, whispering, watching. He called Amy Rowntree first. The maid shuffled forward, still pale, her apron stained where she'd clutched it with nervous hands. Her eyes darted around as though the high, flaking ceiling might fall in on her at any moment. "Name," Bramwell said, though he already knew it. "Amy Rowntree." "Sir." "You work for the Harrows?" "Yes, sir. I help Mrs. Harrow with the fete as well. She always says I've neat hands for folding things." "Tell us what happened this afternoon, from the beginning." Amy took a shuddering breath. "Mrs. Harrow sent me to the supply tent about 2:30. Said she'd mislaid the list for the tombola prizes. She was in such a taking about it, sir. Said everything would be ruined if the wrong people won the wrong things." Several in the hall exchanged looks. That sounded extraordinarily like Henrietta Harrow. "I went to the tent like she told me," Amy continued, "only she wasn't there when I arrived. So I fetched the box with the papers and waited. 10 minutes, maybe. Then I went back to the green to look for her. Mrs. Fanshawe told me she thought Mrs. Harrow had gone to check the accounts with Mr. Briggs." "The treasurer," Bramwell prompted. "Yes, sir. I went back again not long after to see if she'd returned. I had the tablecloths we were to lay for the judge's tea. When I stepped inside—" Her voice broke. She swallowed. "She was there, on the table, just like you saw. I dropped the cloths. I think I screamed. I can't quite recall." "You touched nothing else?" "No, sir. I wouldn't dare." As Amy stepped back, Miss Marple watched her closely. A young woman, frightened, sincere, painfully anxious to say the right thing. But there was no sign of the furtive, sideways glance of a practiced liar. Amy's distress was too uncalculated, too raw. She had seen such looks before, in St. Mary Mead when sudden death visited the unprepared. Next, Bramwell summoned Mr. Charles Harrow. He walked up to the table with a stiffness that might have been grief or old age or both. He was a tall man, gone grey at the temples, his clothes of good quality but carelessly worn, as though someone had chosen them for him, and he had simply submitted. His eyes were bloodshot behind rimless spectacles. "Charles Harrow," he announced in a voice that tried for calm and overshot into weary. "My condolences, Mr. Harrow," Bramwell said, not without genuine sympathy. "We need to know where you were during the fete this afternoon." "At the accounts table most of the time," Harrow replied dully. "I checked the gate takings with Mr. Briggs, then the raffle stub books. Henrietta insisted on absolute accuracy." "That's putting it mildly," murmured someone in the back row. Harrow's eyes flickered briefly toward the voice, then away again, as though even rebuke were beyond him. "I left to fetch a ledger from our car just before 2, he added. "I passed Amy on the way back from the supply tent. After that, I didn't see my wife again until—" He stopped. His Adam's apple bobbed. "Until," Bramwell prompted gently. "Until they came for me," Harrow finished. "Until they said that she'd been—" He took off his spectacles and rubbed them with a handkerchief with such concentration one might have thought they were the problem that needed cleaning. "You didn't go near the supply tent yourself? No quarrels? No disagreements with your wife today?" Harrow gave a short, humorless laugh. "Inspector, if you're asking whether Henrietta and I ever quarreled, the answer would be yes, most days. but not about anything unusual. Certainly not about knives in tents. A spatter of nervous laughter ran through the hall and died quickly. From her chair near the aisle, Miss Marple observed the man's hands. They were long-fingered, ink-stained, the nails uneven and bitten. Not a man much accustomed to physical work. Not that that precluded anything. She had known scholarly-looking men who could do unspeakable things when cornered. But Charles Harrow's chief characteristic, at least today, seemed less anger than exhaustion. One by one the names were called: Mrs. Lydia Copley, brisk and indignant; Mr. Briggs the chemist, thin and fussy, quick to assure the inspector that the Fete funds were in perfect order, absolutely perfect; Julian March, the earnest young man from the candle display; his sister, Beatrice March, that severe woman from earlier, who revealed herself to be the newly elected vice chair of the Ladies' Association. "I was at the historical tableau nearly all afternoon," Beatrice said crisply. "Henrietta entrusted me with ensuring nothing was damaged or mishandled. I saw several people pass near the supply tent, of course. Half the village walks that way, but I observed nothing untoward." Bramwell's pencil scratched. "Your relationship with Mrs. Harrow?" "We worked well together," Beatrice replied, a fraction too quickly. Naturally, there were occasional differences of opinion. She could be inflexible. But we shared the same goal, the success of the Fete. "Funny," whispered Mrs. Pendleton to her neighbor. "I heard Beatrice said last week that if Henrietta didn't step down this year, she'd rather resign than continue under her thumb." Shared goal, indeed. Miss Marple did not turn her head, but she filed away the remark alongside the image of Beatrice March standing guard over that impossible candle. The questioning dragged on until the light outside the high windows had dulled into late afternoon. At last, Bramwell dismissed them with instructions not to leave the village and to report any small detail, however insignificant it may seem. A phrase that caused 3 people instantly to remember seeing mysterious shadows which, upon closer description, turned out to be the vicar's bicycle and a pile of folded deck chairs. Miss Marple and Mrs. Fanshawe walked back to Fanshawe House along the lane. The Fete bunting, left flapping in the evening breeze, looked oddly forlorn now, like decorations for a celebration that had forgotten to occur. "I do hope they find out it was some stranger," Mrs. Fanshawe said anxiously. "A tramp or one of those men who travel with the fairgrounds. It would be too dreadful if it were someone we know." "My dear Agatha," Miss Marple said quietly, "in my experience, it is almost always someone one knows." They reached the gate. Mrs. Fanshawe fumbled with the latch, hands still unsteady. "What do you truly think, Jane? About Henrietta? About that poor girl Amy? The way she screamed? Why, it seemed too dreadful to be feigned." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Too dreadful and too immediate. Shock rarely performs so tidily on command." "Oh, then you don't believe—" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that people will very soon decide whom they wish to blame. It is a curious feature of human nature, and once they have chosen, they will begin to see all manner of evidence to support the choice." She paused. "It can be very dangerous, that sort of seeing." Inside, as Mrs. Fanshawe busied herself with the tea things, because there were a few situations so grave that an Englishwoman could not approach them with teapot in hand, Miss Marple moved to the window. From there, she had a clear view over the village green. In the fading light, a solitary figure crossed it, hurrying toward the Ladies' Association display. Beatrice March. She glanced about once, sharply, then reached under the glass dome. A moment later, the strange candle was no longer on its stand. Miss Marple watched her retreating back, the slightest furrow between her brows. Candles that did not burn down, knives in tidy tents, and a village most anxious to find a stranger to blame. Patterns, she thought. Always, in the end, it was the patterns that told the story. Miss Marple remained by the window long after Beatrice March had vanished from sight, the shadows settling more firmly over the green until only the silhouettes of the tents and the faint glimmer of lamplight from the village hall remained. The removal of the candle, so swiftly, so furtively, troubled her far more than she let on. People did not hide ordinary things. They hid things that might cause questions. Mrs. Fanshawe returned with tea and a plate of shortbread, her hands steadier now that she had something practical to do. "It's all so dreadful," she said, settling into her armchair. "I simply cannot keep the image of poor Henrietta out of my mind. To think, stabbed like that in the middle of a fete." Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic but kept her gaze thoughtful. "You said earlier that Henrietta had faced worse than gossip. What did you mean?" "Oh, did I say that?" Mrs. Fanshawe blinked. "I must have been repeating something Julian March said, or was it Beatrice? They both mentioned that the Harrows had their share of private troubles. Nothing one could repeat, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple echoed, knitting returning smoothly to her hands. "But people so rarely mention such things without reason." Before Mrs. Fanshawe could reply, there came a brisk knock at the door. She started. Good heavens, who could that be at this hour? The inspector stood on the step, hat in hand, looking both tired and determined. "Evening, Mrs. Fanshawe. Miss Marple, might I trouble you for a moment?" Mrs. Fanshawe ushered him inside, fussing with the tea tray, but Bramwell waved it off. "No need, I won't stay." "Miss Marple, you've a reputation for keen eyes. Were you anywhere near the supply tent before the maid discovered Mrs. Harrow?" Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "No, Inspector. I only saw the commotion afterward." "Why do you ask?" Bramwell hesitated, then said, "Because something's off about the timeline. According to Amy, she left the tent once, returned, and found the body the second time. But several witnesses insist they saw Mrs. Harrow walking toward the displays a good 10 minutes after Amy claims she first went to the supply tent. And yet Amy insists she left the tent empty and came back to find, well," Mrs. Fanshawe gasped softly, "you don't think Amy is lying?" "I think," Bramwell said carefully, "that people under shock confuse times, or sometimes misstate them out of fear. I wouldn't accuse her without reason." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "You mentioned witnesses. Who were they?" "Julian and Beatrice March, for one. They claim Mrs. Harrow visited their exhibit briefly to check the signage. Mr. Briggs also recalls seeing her storming across the green to scold the Boy Scouts for the state of their rope display." "That sounds extremely like Henrietta," Mrs. Fanshawe said faintly. "It does," Bramwell agreed. "And that's what troubles me. If Amy is correct, Mrs. Harrow was already in the tent by then. If these others are correct, she wasn't." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Such confusion is common after sudden events. People see shapes and presume identities. A hat, a coat, a brisk walk. It could be enough." "Just so," Bramwell said. "Still, I thought you might keep your ears open. You notice things." It was a surprisingly humble admission from the inspector, who usually prided himself on independence. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I shall certainly mention anything that seems of interest." With that, Bramwell took his leave, and Mrs. Fanshawe closed the door with a sigh. "I do hope the poor man sorts it out quickly. A murderer in High Meadow. It feels like a nightmare." Miss Marple gave a soft hum of agreement, though her thoughts were elsewhere. A woman seen in multiple places at once, a tent with no sign of struggle, a sleeve with an unmistakable smear of wax. And now, Beatrice March whisking away that curious candle. When bedtime came, Mrs. Fanshawe retired early, exhausted by the day's shocks. Miss Marple, however, lingered awake in the guest room, the quiet of the countryside pressing gently against the windows. At last she opened the small notepad she kept in her handbag. She did not write names or accusations. only impressions, the faint threads of human behavior that most overlooked. Henrietta Harrow. Decisive, controlling, feared. Wax smear, knife too clean, tent too orderly. Amy Rowntree, fear genuine. Charles Harrow, exhausted, defeated. Beatrice, removal of candle. Julian, concern about value. Curse. Interesting. She closed the pad. Someone had moved through the fate with purpose, not passion. Murders born of rage left chaos in their wake. This one left only precision. The next morning dawned pale and cool, the sky washed clean by a light overnight rain. Miss Marple and Mrs. Fanshawe walked to the village shop for milk, though neither particularly needed it. The village green looked strangely subdued, tents sagging, tables damp, decorations half fallen. A few villagers stood about, quietly discussing whether the fete should resume later in the week. Not a chance, said Mr. Pettigrew the butcher, not with a killer loose. Oh, nonsense, Mrs. Copley replied. If we stop living entirely, then the murderer has won. Miss Marple watched the exchange with mild interest, then noticed Amy Rowntree hurrying down the lane, eyes downcast, a parcel tucked tightly under her arm. When she saw Miss Marple, she flinched as though struck. "Oh, good morning, miss," she said, bobbing awkwardly. "Good morning, Amy," Miss Marple said kindly. "Are you feeling a little steadier today?" Amy hesitated. I don't know. Inspector Bramwell came to speak with me again. He asked about the times and where I was standing and, well, it all made me feel even more muddled." "I imagine it would," Miss Marple said gently. "Trauma is rarely tidy." Amy bit her lip. "Miss, do you think he suspects me?" "I think," Miss Marple replied in a tone that soothed more than it answered, "that the inspector suspects only that a dreadful thing has happened, and he must make sense of it. That is rarely easy." A small tremor passed through the girl. "I swear I didn't lie. I didn't. Only I don't remember all the details perfectly." "No one expects perfection," Miss Marple said softly. But Amy still seemed troubled. She clutched the parcel tighter. "I should go. Mrs. Harrow's sister asked me to fetch some clothes for her. She's come down from London." "Her sister," Mrs. Fanshawe echoed. "I didn't know Henrietta had any living relatives." "She never spoke of her much," Amy murmured. "But she arrived last night." Miss Marple exchanged a thoughtful look with Mrs. Fanshawe. People who appeared suddenly in the wake of tragedy could sometimes cast more shadow than light. As Amy hurried off, Miss Marple's attention was drawn by a different sound, the scrape of wood on wood. Across the green, Julian March struggled to dismantle the candle exhibit, stacking boards into neat piles. When he noticed Miss Marple, he lifted a hand in greeting, though he looked exhausted. "Poor young man," Mrs. Fanshawe said. "He and his sister worked so hard on those displays." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Curious, though, that Beatrice removed the candle last night." Mrs. Fanshawe blinked. "Removed it? Whatever for?" "That," Miss Marple said quietly, "is something I should very much like to know." And as they continued their walk, Miss Marple felt, with a clarity like the cool morning air, that the heart of the mystery lay not only in who stabbed Henrietta Harrow, but in who understood the strange candle that refused to burn down, and why such a thing might matter enough to kill for. Miss Marple felt the morning settle around her like a thin shawl, cool, crisp, filled with the faint hum of something unspoken moving just beneath the ordinary rhythms of High Meadow. The village was always quiet at this hour, but today the silence felt different, expectant, almost taut, as though the very hedgerows were listening. When she and Mrs. Fanshawe returned home with the milk, they found Inspector Bramwell's bicycle propped against the gate, its metal frame still beaded with dew. Mrs. Fanshawe's hand flew to her chest. Oh dear, he must have news. But Bramwell was not in the drawing room or the hall. They found him instead in the small back garden, studying the rose bushes with an expression of such baffled concentration that one might have thought a clue lay nestled among the petals. He straightened as they approached. "My apologies, Mrs. Fanshawe. Miss Marple, your maid, directed me through. I needed a quiet place to think." "Of course," Mrs. Fanshawe said, though she glanced anxiously at her roses. Bramwell cleared his throat. "I've spoken with Harrow again, and with his sister-in-law, Mrs. Evelyn Carstone, the one who came down from London." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Amy mentioned her." Bramwell nodded. "Quite a forceful woman. She insists the inspector from the city will need to be consulted. Says the Harrow family deserves the best attention." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. "And what do you think, Inspector?" "That I don't need interference," he muttered. "But I do need clarity." He took a breath. "Something was stolen from the Ladies' Association tent last night. The treasurer came to report it first thing this morning." "Not the candle?" Mrs. Fanshawe gasped. "No, the candle was catalogued as separate property and was under Beatrice March's care. The missing item is smaller. A silver pocket watch belonging to Mrs. Harrow, engraved. She used it during the fete to time the events." "That sounds like Henrietta," Mrs. Fanshawe murmured. "She never trusted the church bell, said it rang slow in winter." "Quite." Bramwell scratched his cheek. "The odd thing is, Harrow insists she left the watch at home yesterday morning. He says she meant to wear it but changed her mind." "Then why?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Did several villagers say they saw her checking the time throughout the day?" Bramwell's shoulders sagged slightly. "That is exactly the question." For a moment, only the soft rustle of leaves filled the garden. Then he continued more hesitantly. "There's another matter. The candle, the unusual one, Marcus March, the father of Julian and Beatrice, donated it to the village decades ago. Briggs remembers the ceremony. I've looked into old inventories. It seems Mrs. Harrow had been pushing to have the candle restored and valued. Said it was deteriorating." "Yet it showed no signs of deterioration yesterday," Miss Marple remarked. "Quite the opposite." Bramwell looked at her sharply, but she only met his gaze with mild interest. "Mrs. Fanshawe seemed eager to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "What of poor Amy? Have you sorted her timeline?" Bramwell rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Not entirely, and now this theft, small though it may seem, complicates everything. I'd hoped it was coincidence, but I doubt it." Miss Marple felt the faintest stir of certainty. Theft, more often than not, was born of opportunity. Murder, however, rarely was. After Bramwell departed, Mrs. Fanshawe fussed in the kitchen, clearly unsettled. Miss Marple took her tea into the garden and settled beneath the old pear tree. The branches quivered lightly even without wind, as though echoing her own quiet contemplation. Someone had impersonated Henrietta Harrow at least once that afternoon. Someone had wanted the appearance of her moving about the fete while her true body lay unseen. Why? For alibi? For confusion? Or simply to delay the moment of discovery? Her thoughts drifted to Beatrice March. Why remove the candle in secrecy? Why not simply collect the exhibit in the morning like everyone else? Perhaps there was something more to the object than a quaint historical piece. Julian March's words returned to her. "I told them we oughtn't use anything valuable." He believed the candle held worth, but worth in what sense? Monetary? Sentimental? Or something more arcane? Mid-morning found Miss Marple with purpose. She wrapped a knitted shawl around her shoulders and made her way to the March household, a tidy brick home shaded by 2 tall limes. As she approached, she heard raised voices inside. "You had no right," Julian was saying. "Beatrice, it wasn't yours to take." "It was unsafe to leave it there," Beatrice snapped. "After what happened, the police would have treated it like evidence. They'd have mishandled it, damaged it. They have a murder to solve." Miss Marple rang the bell before Julian could reply. It was answered not by either March sibling, but by a lean, silver-haired man with a scholar's posture and keen eyes. Marcus March himself. "Miss Marple," he said, recognizing her at once. "From the fete. Won't you come in?" Julian and Beatrice both turned as she entered the sitting room. Julian looked abashed, Beatrice uncomfortably rigid. "I do apologize," Marcus said. "My children are somewhat distressed today. The events yesterday were grim." "Understandably so," Miss Marple replied. She allowed her gaze to drift to a small table near the window. On it sat the silver candlestick, its beeswax candle intact, as smooth and tall as it had been yesterday. Julian followed her gaze and sighed. "Beatrice brought it back last night. She thinks the police might confiscate it." Beatrice's chin lifted. "Given what happened to Mrs. Harrow, can you blame me? People will look for symbols, superstitions, anything to fill a void in understanding." Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "Oh, I doubt the inspector is prone to superstition. He seems an eminently practical man, but he would naturally question why you removed the candle in such a hurry." Beatrice stiffened. "I didn't want it stolen. The fete grounds weren't secure." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, though her tone left the question gently lingering. Marcus stepped closer to the candle. "Odd thing, really. This piece has been in our family for generations. Some say it was created by a craftsman who experimented with unusual wax mixtures." He tapped the glass cover lightly. "It's said to burn extraordinarily slowly. A novelty. I donated it when my wife passed. Henrietta insisted it should be displayed properly, not left to gather dust." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Your wife knew Mrs. Harrow well." Marcus's expression softened with memory. "Very well. They were school friends. Fell out in later years, but I suppose old loyalties never quite disappear." Beatrice's mouth thinned. "Mother always said Henrietta meddled." Julian winced. "Beatrice?" But Miss Marple only nodded. "People meddle when they care too deeply or too broadly. It can be hard to distinguish the two." Her eyes drifted again to the candle, a flame that does not diminish, a smear of wax on a dead woman's sleeve. A watch appearing where it should not be. Patterns. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you for your time. I won't keep you longer, but perhaps, if it is not too much trouble, Mr. March could tell me more about the watch Mrs. Harrow used. You said she was fond of punctuality. Had she any particular habits with her timekeeping?" Marcus exchanged a look with Julian, whose brows lifted in faint surprise. "The watch?" Marcus repeated. "Well, Henrietta did value exactness. She often carried the watch at gatherings so she could remind others when they were tarrying too long. But as to habits, she wound it twice daily, left it always in the top drawer of her writing desk. She never misplaced it." "Never?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Not once in 30 years, Marcus said. She treated it almost like a talisman." Miss Marple thanked them once more and left with unhurried steps, though inside her thoughts were moving as swiftly as a mountain stream after thaw. A woman who never misplaced her watch had somehow misplaced it yesterday. A demonstration candle that never burned down had left wax where it did not belong, and someone had needed Henrietta Harrow seen moving about long after she was dead. The mechanics of the thing were not yet clear, but the shape of a truth, partial, elusive, was beginning to form. And Miss Marple, experienced in such matters, knew that when truths began to take shape, shadows lengthened for those who had something to hide. Miss Marple took her time walking back toward Fanshawe House, letting the quiet rustle of the lime trees settle the thoughts that had begun to crowd her mind. High Meadows lanes twisted gently between well-kept hedges and tidy stone cottages, yet every turn seemed to whisper another fragment of the puzzle. The candle, the watch, the uncertain sightings, the too orderly tent, all separate pieces that refused so far, to a line. She paused near the green, where Julian March was now helping to dismantle the larger exhibits. He paused when he saw her, brushing dust from his jacket. "Miss Marple, did my father trouble you with too much talk? He does enjoy reminiscing." "Oh, not at all," she said kindly. "Your father is most illuminating. I find older histories often cast helpful light on present matters." Julian hesitated, glancing toward the remains of the candle display. "You asked about the watch," he said in a low voice. "I didn't want to mention it in front of Beatrice, but Mrs. Harrow visited our exhibit 3 times yesterday. The last time she checked that watch of hers obsessively, 5 or 6 times within a minute." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, "especially if she was meant to have left it at home." Julian's frown deepened. "Exactly. I thought it odd at the time. She kept muttering the same thing under her breath. 'Not yet. Not yet.' I assumed she meant some timetable for the fete." Miss Marple's knitting fingers twitched instinctively, though she carried no yarn now. "And this was well before 2 o'clock?" "Yes, closer to 1:30. She nodded slowly, thanked him, and continued on. "Not yet. Not yet." The words slid into place beside too many inconsistencies to ignore. Mrs. Fanshawe was waiting at the gate, her apron dusted with flour. "Oh, Jane, you took ages. I've made scones. Do come in. And you've missed the most shocking news." "More shocking than yesterday's murder?" Miss Marple asked gently, stepping inside. "Not quite that, but unsettling nonetheless. Mrs. Carstone, the sister, has been going door to door, asking whether anyone saw Henrietta with her watch. She claims the watch must have been stolen before she died." "Before?" Miss Marple repeated, shedding her shawl. "What an interesting distinction." Mrs. Fanshawe lowered her voice as though the hydrangeas might overhear. "I think she believes someone in the village hated Henrietta enough to torment her. Said she found letters, anonymous ones. Nasty things. Did she show them to Inspector Bramwell?" "No. She said she would only show them to someone from Scotland Yard." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully, though her mind was racing. Anonymous letters were rarely anonymous in intent. They revealed more about the sender's anxieties than their secrets. As they spoke, the bell rang again. Mrs. Fanshawe looked heavenward. High Meadow has never been so busy. This time the caller was Charles Harrow. He looked worse than he had the day before, his face sallow, his coat buttoned crooked, his hands trembling faintly. "Miss Marple," he said as soon as she approached, "may I speak with you privately?" Mrs. Fanshawe ushered him into the drawing-room. He remained standing as though sitting might break something inside him that was barely holding together. "I don't know who else to turn to," he began. "The inspector. He thinks I'm confused about the watch, but I'm not. Henrietta left it at home. I saw her place it in the desk drawer myself yesterday morning." Miss Marple regarded him with calm sympathy. "Then she must have retrieved it later." He shook his head vehemently. "No, we left together. She walked ahead with Mrs. Carston. I locked the house behind us." His voice tightened. "If the watch was at the fete, someone else must have taken it from our home." "And placed it with her?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," he whispered, "to make it appear she'd used it yesterday. Why would anyone do such a thing?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she asked, "Mr. Harrow, may I inquire, was your marriage a contented one?" He sighed, the sound of a man drowning slowly. "Henrietta was very determined, very strong-minded. She believed rules were the pillars that held society upright. I did not always agree. Then, almost inaudibly, but I didn't want her dead." "I believe you," Miss Marple said softly, and the relief in his eyes was almost painful. He leaned closer. "There is something else. Last night, after the inspector left, I found a slip of paper in Henrietta's coat pocket. It looked torn from a larger sheet. It read only, 2 o'clock precisely. Nothing more. 2 o'clock, Miss Marple murmured. The approximate time of her death, according to the constable. Yes, but that note, it felt like an appointment, not a threat. Henrietta never missed appointments. May I see it? He handed over the scrap. Miss Marple studied the thin, slanted handwriting. Feminine, but not Henrietta's. Thank you, Mr. Harrow, she said. You have been most helpful. When he had gone, Mrs. Fanshawe looked quite shaken. Jane, do you think the murderer lured Henrietta to the tent with that note? That is a distinct possibility, Miss Marple replied, though I find it equally plausible that the note was placed after the fact. But why? To create a false sense of consent, as though she intended to meet someone privately. It would nudge suspicion toward impropriety. Villagers do love a scandal. Mrs. Fanshawe put a hand to her throat. Good heavens, how wicked! Human nature can be quite inventive when guilt requires redirecting. She folded the paper carefully. But the handwriting, that will be important. They were interrupted again, this time by Mrs. Carstone herself sweeping up the path. She was an imposing woman draped in black silk, her sharp eyes scanning everything at once. Miss Marple, she said without preamble, I'm told you are a woman of sense in this otherwise hopeless village. My sister did not deserve such an end, and I will not have the inspector bungling the investigation. I intend to uncover the truth. An admirable intention, Miss Marple said gently. How do you propose to begin? With her effects, Mrs. Carstone declared, her jewelry, her correspondence, her private papers. Someone must have wanted something from her. Miss Marple watched her closely. There was grief in Mrs. Carstone's eyes, yes, but also ambition, and a certain eagerness that suggested long frustrations with Henrietta had not died with her. Do you mind, Miss Marple asked quietly, if I inquire whether Henrietta kept any financial burdens, debts, insurance concerns? Mrs. Carstone stiffened. If there were such matters, they would be none of this village's business. Miss Marple inclined her head, and Mrs. Carstone swept away just as quickly as she had arrived. Mrs. Fanshawe stared after her. I never liked that woman. She has a way of answering that feels like a door slamming. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the green, where the last of the exhibits had been dismantled. Only the faint impressions of tent ropes remained on the grass, like ghostly outlines waiting to be filled again. That, she said quietly, is often the way with doors hiding something. She sat down, her mind weaving the threads together. A watch that shouldn't have been present, a candle taken in secret, a note at 2 o'clock, sightings that contradicted time, and a village straining to force the pieces into familiar shapes. But the shapes were wrong. Somewhere in High Meadow, Miss Marple knew, a very simple truth lay buried beneath very deliberate confusion, and as she picked up her knitting once more, she felt the faint tug that always came when a mystery's edge had finally brushed her fingertips. Miss Marple spent the early afternoon in quiet contemplation, though her knitting needles moved with their usual serene purpose. Mrs. Fanshawe had gone upstairs to lie down, claiming, with uncharacteristic frailty, that the strain of the last 2 days had left her with a migrainous flutter. The house was still, save for the occasional sigh of wind in the rafters, yet the stillness only sharpened the edges of Miss Marple's thoughts. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make Henrietta Harrow seem alive after she was already dead. Someone had moved objects, manipulated times, and created impressions. And now someone wished to direct suspicion either toward theft, scandal, or domestic discord. But such elaborate obfuscation rarely served a simple motive. A knock at the back door interrupted her musing. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and went to open it, expecting perhaps the milkman. Instead, she found Julian March standing there, cap in hand, his expression knotted with uncertainty. "Forgive me, Miss Marple," he said. I didn't want to intrude, but, well, I thought you ought to know something. She stepped aside. Do come in. You look quite troubled. He entered hesitantly, perching on the edge of a kitchen chair. It's about the candle, he began, and perhaps also about Mrs. Harrow. Miss Marple poured him a modest cup of tea. Yes, Julian exhaled shakily. Last month, Henrietta asked me to look over some old documents belonging to my father, archival things about the candle. She said she wanted to petition the association to put it in a glass case permanently. At first, I thought she simply meant to display family history. But then she asked me, privately, whether I knew anything about the candle being tampered with over the years. Tampered? Miss Marple echoed mildly. Julian nodded. She believed someone had altered it. She said the wax was too perfect, too smooth. She suspected someone had recast it decades ago, but she couldn't find proof. Miss Marple considered him with keen interest. And why should such a thing matter? That is the point, Julian said helplessly. I don't know. She seemed distressed, almost frightened. I thought it was part of her usual fussing over traditions, but now, well, now she's dead. And the candle has been removed under unusual circumstances, Miss Marple added softly. Julian swallowed hard. Beatrice denies it, but I'm sure she knows more than she'll say. He lowered his voice. My father once hinted that the candle wasn't merely slow burning. He said it was made using a secret method that had implications, something to do with inheritance, though he refused to elaborate. Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. Inheritance is a most powerful motivator, dear Julian. It inspires more mischief than jealousy or passion combined. Julian looked suddenly ill. Do you think someone might have killed Mrs. Harrow for a candle? I think, Miss Marple said, that murder rarely hinges on one object alone. But the meanings people attach to objects, those can be very dangerous indeed. Before she could inquire further, another knock sounded. Sharp, officious, impatient. Julian flinched. Miss Marple rose. At the door stood Mrs. Evelyn Carstone, her black silk rustling like raven's wings in the breeze. Her gaze snapped from Miss Marple to Julian and narrowed. So, she said crisply, this is where you've been skulking. I suspected as much. Julian stumbled to his feet. Mrs. Carstone, I wasn't— You were avoiding me, she interrupted, shouldering past him into the kitchen. And with good reason, it seems, for I have discovered something most alarming. Miss Marple regarded the woman politely. Indeed. Mrs. Carstone held up a small leather notebook. I found this in Henrietta's writing desk. It is not hers. The handwriting is entirely unfamiliar, yet it contains notes about her daily movements, her quarrels, her finances. Someone was studying her. Julian stared. Studying? Mrs. Carstone snapped the notebook shut. I demand to know who in this village would keep such a thing. I intend to show it to the inspector at once. Miss Marple extended a hand gently. May I look at it? Mrs. Carstone hesitated, then reluctantly passed it over. Miss Marple examined a page. The neat, slanted handwriting matched neither Henrietta's bold scrawl, nor Charles Harrow's academic hand, nor the sharp, angular script Beatrice used. It was precise, almost delicate, yet with a firmness that suggested control. She closed the notebook. Where exactly did you find this? In the drawer with Henrietta's correspondence, Mrs. Carstone replied, bristling. And I know it wasn't there before. She guarded her desk carefully. Then someone may have placed it there quite recently, Miss Marple said. Julian paled. That suggests someone returned to the Harrow house after the murder. Indeed, Miss Marple said, or had access beforehand. Mrs. Carstone's eyes flashed. You suspect me, perhaps, because I came from London? Not at all, Miss Marple replied calmly. But I do wonder why you were so certain the watch was stolen before your sister's death. Mrs. Carstone stiffened visibly, because she would not have gone anywhere without informing me. We spoke that morning. She trusted only me. Julian shifted uncomfortably, and Miss Marple noted it. Mrs. Carstone drew herself up. I shall take this notebook to the inspector, and when the truth comes out, those who have lied will regret it. She swept out without waiting for a reply, leaving Julian looking utterly overwhelmed. I should go too, he murmured. I've troubled you enough. Not at all, Miss Marple said, seeing him to the door. You have been very helpful. More helpful, I suspect, than you realize. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to the kitchen and opened the notebook again. One passage in particular drew her attention. It refuses to relinquish candle. Claims proof must be found. If she persists, intervention needed before fate. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. Intervention, a chilling word, depending on who used it. She sat down, folding her hands neatly. The patterns were tightening. Henrietta Harrow had suspected something about the candle. Someone else had suspected that she suspected. And somewhere between suspicion and certainty, a murder had taken place. A soft creak above signaled that Mrs. Fanshawe was awake. Miss Marple rose, but paused at the foot of the stairs. A faint scent lingered, a delicate, unmistakable trace. Beeswax. Fresh, warm beeswax. Miss Marple touched the banister thoughtfully. That scent had no business being in Fanshawe House. Someone who had handled the candle, or something connected to it, had been here. And Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that the next move in the pattern was fast approaching. Miss Marple followed the faint trail of beeswax scent up the stairs, though she moved without urgency, as if simply checking on her cousin. Mrs. Fanshawe emerged from her bedroom just as Miss Marple reached the landing, smoothing her hair and attempting a brave little smile. "Oh, Jane, I must look a fright. Nerves, that's all. I thought a short rest would help, but now I feel rather silly for lying down at all." "Not silly, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "These events would unsettle anyone." She glanced casually around the landing. The hall runner bore no signs of muddy footprints. The windows were shut, yet the warm, unmistakable scent of beeswax lingered, as though someone had stood there only minutes before. "Did anyone come to see you while I was downstairs?" she asked. Mrs. Fanshawe paused, surprised. "No, not that I recall. I may have dozed, but I didn't hear a thing." Miss Marple nodded, though she privately doubted no one had passed. The scent was too fresh. Someone had stood on this landing, likely very recently, and that someone had handled the candle or its casing. She let the matter rest for the moment. Pressing her cousin would yield little. Mrs. Fanshawe was the type to apologize for not remembering the movements of a draft. "Come along," Miss Marple said. "Tea will do us both good." They had barely reached the kitchen when a rapid knock sounded at the front door. Sharp, anxious, and insistent. Mrs. Fanshawe startled, sloshing tea onto the saucer. More callers? Heavens, one would think this house were the post office. Miss Marple answered the door to find Inspector Bramwell, breathless and flushed from the exertion of cycling. "Miss Marple, thank goodness. I hoped you hadn't gone out. There's been, well, not another murder," he added hastily, as Mrs. Fanshawe let out a squeak, "but something you ought to hear." Miss Marple ushered him inside, offering him a chair. Bramwell sat heavily, wiping perspiration from his brow. "It's Amy Rowntree," he said. "She's disappeared." Mrs. Fanshawe nearly dropped the teapot. Disappeared? The poor girl, but surely she wouldn't run away unless she were guilty. "Or frightened," Miss Marple said softly. "Where was she last seen?" "At the Harrow house," Bramwell replied. "Mrs. Carstone sent her to fetch a box from Henrietta's study. Apparently Amy never returned. Carstone assumed she'd been dawdling and went to find her. The study window was open. Amy was gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple repeated. But did anyone hear or see anything? No witnesses so far, Bramwell grumbled. But it's odd. She left her handbag behind, and she's not the type to wander without it. Miss Marple's mind stirred. And Mrs. Carstone, how did she seem? Annoyed, Bramwell said. Said the girl probably panicked after giving contradictory statements. Carstone was ready to accuse her of theft on the spot. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Mrs. Fanshawe. The sisters' eagerness to cast blame was becoming more pronounced by the hour. But something else happened, Bramwell added. Something very strange. He reached into his coat and pulled out an object wrapped in a handkerchief. When he unfolded it, a soft gasp escaped Mrs. Fanshawe, the silver pocket watch. Henrietta's. Found not in the tent, nor at the fete, but tangled in the ivy beneath the Harrows' study window. Miss Marple leaned in. The watch fell during Amy's disappearance? That's the tricky bit, Bramwell said. Mrs. Carstone swears it wasn't there earlier. And Harrow is adamant that Henrietta left it at home yesterday morning. He rubbed his temples. Either someone planted it outside the window, or Amy dropped it fleeing through it. But I don't understand why the girl would do that. Miss Marple studied the watch with a serene expression, though inside her thoughts drew tighter knots. The watch returned. Amy vanished, a notebook rewritten by an unknown hand, and beeswax that wandered places it had no earthly cause to be. It may be, Miss Marple said softly, that Amy saw something, or someone, she wasn't meant to see. Bramwell frowned. Then why vanish rather than speak? In my experience, Inspector, fear can be a most compelling silencer, especially fear born of misunderstanding. Mrs. Fanshawe wrung her hands. But what would she have misunderstood? Almost anything, Miss Marple murmured. A movement, a voice, a shadow. Villages are full of shadows. Before Bramwell could respond, another knock sounded, this one hesitant, uncertain. Mrs. Fanshawe scurried to answer it and returned with Mr. Briggs, the chemist, who looked as though he had encountered a ghost. Miss Marple. Inspector, I came straight away, he said breathlessly. I've discovered something unusual in my shop ledger, something to do with the candle. Bramwell stiffened. The candle again? Briggs nodded vigorously, removing his bowler hat with trembling hands. Last week someone purchased a compound of wax-softening agents, harmless in small quantities. But used cleverly, well, they can make a candle appear unburnt, even restore surface smoothness. He swallowed. The buyer signed the order slip but used a false name. What name? Bramwell demanded. Briggs hesitated. It said only H. Harrow. The room fell into silence. Mrs. Fanshawe gasped. Bramwell cursed softly, but Miss Marple only shook her head. No, she said, her voice calm but firm. No, I do not believe Henrietta Harrow purchased anything of the sort. But the signature, Briggs began. Henrietta wrote with a heavy hand, Miss Marple said. Her script was broad, emphatic. This notebook, she gestured toward the leather book Mrs. Carstone had found, contains writing slender and precise, the same quality one sees on shop receipts requiring neatness. You think someone forged her name? Bramwell asked. I think, Miss Marple replied, that someone attempted a clever deception but did not understand how deeply habits of handwriting run. Briggs blinked. Then the false signature is our murderer's. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, or someone acting under instruction. Bramwell leaned forward. Miss Marple, if you have a theory, for heaven's sake, share it. Not yet, she said gently. It is not yet time. Mrs. Fanshawe exhaled shakily. But Jane, what is all this with the candle? Miss Marple rose slowly. Her movements were delicate but purposeful. The candle, she said, is at the heart of everything, not for its flame, but for what it symbolizes. Henrietta suspected something about it, something someone else desperately wished to hide, someone who understood that timing is everything. That a candle which burns without burning down can make time seem to stand still. Her voice lowered. And that if time can appear to stand still, then a woman can seem alive long after she is dead. A hush fell, brittle and fragile. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters as though impatient for the truth to emerge. Miss Marple folded her hands. "I believe," she said softly, "it is time we visited the Harrow house. There are answers there waiting to be seen, if one arrives before the shadows learn to rearrange themselves again." Inspector Bramwell insisted on cycling ahead, but Miss Marple and Mrs. Fanshawe followed on foot, allowing her the quiet she needed to arrange the thoughts, gathering in a delicate lattice. By the time they reached the Harrow house, a tall, grey stone structure with ivy clinging to its window sills, Bramwell was already speaking with Charles Harrow in the doorway. The widower looked even more hollow than earlier, as though each new development chipped away another piece of him. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping aside at once, "if you believe you can help, please come in." Mrs. Carstone appeared in the hallway behind him, stiff as a drawn bow. Her expression sharpened upon seeing Miss Marple. "More interference," she murmured under her breath, though loud enough that no one could mistake it for anything but deliberate. Miss Marple ignored the jab and stepped inside. The house had a heavy stillness to it, one that did not come from grief alone. Something about the air felt disturbed, as though one presence too many had occupied it in the last day. "Inspector," she asked gently, "where was Amy last seen?" "The study," Bramwell replied, motioning down the corridor. "Carstone claims Amy entered to fetch a stationery box, then vanished through the window." "That is not what I claimed," Mrs. Carstone snapped. "I said the girl was gone when I returned. The window was open. Draw your own conclusions." Miss Marple offered a polite smile. "Conclusions can be misleading things, Mrs. Carstone. I prefer patterns." She led the way toward the study, and Bramwell followed, though he looked perplexed by her certainty. The study itself was small, but meticulously arranged, Henrietta's influence evident in every tidy stack of correspondence and perfectly aligned ledger. The window facing the garden was unlatched, its frame smudged faintly, though not nearly as much as one would expect if a panicked girl had fled through it. Miss Marple touched the sill lightly. No loose fibers, no scrape marks from shoes or hurried escape. "She did not go out this way," Miss Marple said softly. "But the watch was found below it," Bramwell argued. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Placed there." Mrs. Fanshawe gasped. "Placed? Oh, Jane, by whom?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the writing desk. "May I see the notebook again?" Mrs. Carstone produced it reluctantly, as though afraid it might implicate her simply by proximity. Miss Marple opened it to the middle pages, flipping through neatly penned lines describing Henrietta's daily movements, her visits, her quarrels, her errands. The writing was precise and controlled. She then approached the small wastebasket beside the desk. It was nearly empty, save for a few tightly crumpled bits of paper. With Bramwell's nod, she lifted them out carefully. One contained only a slanted scrawl, the tail end of a sentence. "Proof must be hidden before—" The remainder had been aggressively torn away. Another scrap bore a faint waxy smear, pale yellow. Miss Marple held it beneath the lamplight. "Beeswax again," she murmured. "It travels with remarkable persistence." Mrs. Carstone stiffened. "What does that prove? This is a village. Wax is everywhere." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "Not this wax. This is of the same unique composition as the March candle. The scent is unmistakable. Whoever handled that candle handled these papers as well." Bramwell rubbed the back of his neck. "But why would anyone bring beeswax into Henrietta's study?" Mrs. Fanshawe gave a small, involuntary cry. The candle never burned down. "Perhaps they used it for light?" Miss Marple shook her head. Not for light, for imitation. She walked slowly toward a small mirror hanging beside the desk. The surface was faintly smudged by fingerprints, fresh ones, judging by their moisture. "Inspector," she said, "do you recall the conflicting accounts yesterday? Some villagers saw Henrietta after she should already have been dead." "Yes," Bramwell said slowly, "but you suggested they might have mistaken someone else for her." "Indeed." Miss Marple pointed to the mirror, "and here is where such a person prepared. A reflection can serve as reassurance when forming a disguise, especially if one must imitate a woman's posture, her walk, her expression." Charles Harrow let out a low, strangled noise. "A disguise? Someone pretended to be Henrietta?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Someone donned her coat, carried her watch, and walked the fete grounds deliberately. The candle made the timing possible, the wax on Henrietta's sleeve, and these papers indicates it was used as a reference or tool. Its slow-burning nature allowed someone to measure intervals precisely, to keep to a false timeline." Bramwell stared. Then the realization dawned. So that her death would appear to have happened later than it did. "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "A false alibi for the murderer." Mrs. Carstone's face twisted. "This is absurd. Who would go to such elaborate lengths?" Miss Marple turned to the woman, her expression soft but probing. "Someone who needed the village to believe Henrietta was alive at 2 o'clock. Someone who knew her habits intimately, and her weaknesses. Someone already familiar with the Harrow house." Mrs. Carstone's eyes narrowed. "I hope you are not implying—" But Miss Marple was already moving again, her attention caught by the smallest of details, a tiny glint beneath the edge of the rug. She crouched, slowly, carefully, and drew it out. A button. Silver. Ornate. The crest engraved upon it unmistakable. Julian March's coat buttons bore that same crest. Mrs. Fanshawe gasped. Bramwell looked thunderstruck. Miss Marple turned the button over in her palm. "Inspector, I believe it is time we spoke to Julian March again. Not with accusations. No, not yet. But with questions. Questions about why he feared the candle so much he wished it removed, and why a button from his coat lies in a room where he claims never to have been." Mrs. Carstone's lips thinned into a jagged line. "So he killed my sister?" Miss Marple shook her head. No, I do not think Julian March is capable of murder." Bramwell frowned. "Then how do you explain this?" Miss Marple closed her fingers gently around the button. "By remembering that disguises come in many forms. Some are worn on the body, and some are worn upon one's guilt. The person who entered this study wore a coat that bore these buttons, but that person was not Julian March." Mrs. Fanshawe whispered, "Then who?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the staircase. The same staircase scented faintly with beeswax earlier. "Inspector," she said quietly, "please find Beatrice March." Bramwell stared at Miss Marple as though she had spoken a foreign language. "Beatrice March. But she's been cooperating, at least on the surface. And Julian said—" "Julian said many things," Miss Marple replied gently. "But what people say is far less telling than what they fear. And Julian is very much afraid for someone." Mrs. Fanshawe looked horrified. "You don't mean he's covering for Beatrice?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she held up the silver button, letting it catch the late afternoon light. "This button did not fall from Julian's coat yesterday. Look closely, the thread remnants are white. Julian's coat uses black thread. Beatrice, however, has a walking coat trimmed with silver buttons. She wore it yesterday morning, and she's tall enough, slender enough, and poised enough to have imitated Henrietta's bearing, particularly for those glimpses in the distance." Bramwell, to his credit, moved quickly from shock to action. "We'll find her at once," he said, already stepping toward the door. But Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "Inspector, if you approach her directly, she may run, and a cornered mind is unpredictable. Better to allow her to return to us on her own terms." "Return?" Bramwell echoed. "Why would she?" "Because Beatrice believes she has hidden everything necessary," Miss Marple said. "But she has forgotten that Amy Rowntree is missing, and Amy knows something." The air tightened with a quiet dread. Charles Harrow's voice emerged, thin and wavering. "Miss Marple, you don't think Beatrice harmed Amy too?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that Amy saw Beatrice do something, perhaps at the fete, perhaps later, and was frightened, and Beatrice, knowing the girl's nature, feared she might confide in someone." Mrs. Fanshawe pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "Then we must find her, poor child." Bramwell looked torn between storming off and listening further. Miss Marple stepped toward the study desk again, her fingers hovering over the drawer containing the false notebook. "Beatrice believed Henrietta had uncovered a secret about the candle," she said softly. "And if the candle was connected to inheritance, as Julian hinted, then Henrietta's intent to have it restored or appraised may have threatened Beatrice's sense of entitlement." Charles Harrow looked puzzled. "But the candle belonged to the March family. How could it affect Henrietta?" "Not the candle itself," Miss Marple corrected gently, "but what Henrietta may have found out about its history. Something significant enough to shift an inheritance claim. Perhaps Beatrice altered records long ago. Perhaps she manipulated dates. Perhaps even forged parts of the March lineage. If Henrietta had proof, then all Beatrice had built, even her place in village society, would crumble." Mrs. Carstone, who had been glaring silently from the corner, suddenly stepped forward. "But why kill her? A dispute could be settled without violence." Miss Marple's expression softened with sadness. "Not when pride is at stake. Pride and fear form a very potent mixture." Bramwell turned toward the door again. "I must find Beatrice before anything else happens." Miss Marple raised a hand. "Inspector, before you leave, there is something more important you must hear." Bramwell froze, hand on the doorknob. "What now?" "Amy is not missing," Miss Marple said quietly. Mrs. Fanshawe gave a small cry. Charles Harrow gasped. Bramwell looked stunned. Miss Marple continued calmly. "Amy is hiding. Not well. She is not skilled at concealment, but she is nearby. Likely somewhere associated with the Harrow household, where she feels both frightened and obligated." "But you said she didn't go out the window," Bramwell began. "She didn't," Miss Marple confirmed. "Her handbag inside proves she did not intend to flee. The open window was staged. Amy likely returned to the study after being sent away, found something she ought not have seen, and panicked." Charles Harrow's knees buckled slightly. "Found what?" Miss Marple looked at him sympathetically. "The button, perhaps. Or Beatrice herself. Or something connected to Henrietta's papers. But whatever she saw frightened her enough to hide, but not leave the house." Mrs. Fanshawe whispered, "Then she's still here?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "And the beeswax scent upstairs confirms it. Beatrice came here earlier today. She searched the upper rooms. She was looking for Amy, or for something Amy might have taken." Bramwell swore softly. "Then she may come back. We cannot leave the house unguarded." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "We must not. But we must also find Amy before Beatrice does." Mrs. Fanshawe looked around hopelessly. But where would a frightened girl hide? The attic, the cellar, the garden shed. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, those require movement, noise, risk. Amy is timid, not reckless." Her eyes drifted to a small cupboard beside the stairs. A cupboard Henrietta Harrow had famously used to store cleaning supplies and linens in obsessive alphabetical order. "I believe," Miss Marple said, walking toward it, "that Amy chose the safest place she could imagine, the place no one would search because Henrietta never allowed it to be touched." She opened the cupboard gently. Inside, huddled behind neatly stacked linen bundles, tear-streaked and trembling, was Amy Rowntree. The girl flinched violently at the light, burying her face in her apron. Miss Marple knelt carefully. "My dear," she said softly, "no one will harm you now." Amy sobbed harder. I didn't mean to see it. I only came back for the ledger. She didn't know I was there. I saw her put the watch in the drawer, not Henrietta." Miss Marple nodded gently. "You saw Beatrice?" Amy shook uncontrollably. "And she saw me, or thought she did. I ran and hid. I was so afraid she'd... Bramwell stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Gently, Inspector. The child has been through enough." Amy clung to Miss Marple's skirt. "She killed Mrs. Harrow. She killed her and then walked around in her coat like nothing happened. I saw the coat on the peg. I thought it strange, and then..." She broke down completely. Miss Marple held her until the sobs quieted. Then she spoke with a calmness that settled the entire room. "Inspector, you now have your witness, but be cautious. Beatrice March will not surrender easily. Her pride is too wounded. She has already risked everything, and desperate people can be very dangerous." Bramwell straightened, his jaw tight. "I'll bring her in, carefully." Miss Marple stood as well, her gaze drifting toward the window and the village beyond it, where long shadows were beginning to stretch across the fields. "Beatrice will come," she said softly. "Because she believes she has finished her work, because she believes no one has seen through the masquerade." Her eyes darkened with quiet certainty, and because pride always returns to the scene of its own deception. The house grew very still after Amy's confession. A fragile silence stretched taut across the rooms like a thin sheet of glass. Inspector Bramwell signaled his constable to remain outside, stationed discreetly along the garden path in case Beatrice returned sooner than expected. Miss Marple, ever gentle, guided Amy to a chair near the hearth, wrapping a shawl around her trembling shoulders, while Mrs. Fanshawe brewed tea with the solemn urgency usually reserved for church emergencies. Charles Harrow stood apart, leaning heavily against the doorway as though each new truth pressed weight upon him. Miss Marple watched him for a moment, noting the way his hands gripped the wood, white-knuckled, strained. Grief, she knew, rarely traveled alone. It often walked hand in hand with bewilderment, guilt, and sometimes even relief. But in Charles's case, it walked with exhaustion, a long-standing tiredness that Henrietta's sharp orderliness had likely intensified over the years. Bramwell paced, frustration simmering beneath his calm facade. "We'll have to take Amy's statement formally," he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose, "and then locate Beatrice before she realizes her plans come apart." Miss Marple nodded, though her gaze drifted toward the window. The last of daylight clung weakly to the sky, dipping behind the hedgerows in muted gold. Shadows lengthened across the village green with an almost creeping intention. "She will come soon," Miss Marple said quietly. "Beatrice is not a woman who leaves affairs unfinished." Amy whimpered softly. Miss Marple laid a hand on her knee. "You did nothing wrong, my dear. You were simply in the wrong place at a dangerous moment." Amy's voice cracked as she whispered, "She'll be angry. She'll know I talked." "No," Miss Marple said. "She will think she still has the advantage, that no one has connected the candle, the forged notebook, or the watch to her actions. She believes she's been clever, and cleverness, unchecked by conscience, becomes vanity." Bramwell cast her a long, skeptical look. "How can you be so certain she'll return here? If she thinks Amy may have spoken, she'll flee." Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh no, Inspector. Beatrice March does not flee. She confronts. She manages. She controls. This house holds the last threads of her deception. She believes she must secure them." Outside, a faint crunch of gravel interrupted them. Slow, deliberate steps on the garden path. Bramwell tensed, hand moving toward his coat pocket. Mrs. Fanshawe squeaked and ducked behind the parlor door. Amy whimpered again, shrinking deeper into the shawl. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression composed. The steps paused. A shadow passed the window, then came a knock, not frantic, not hesitant, but measured. Confident. Bramwell took position beside the door, jaw set. Miss Marple gave a small, encouraging nod, and he opened it with the authority of a man prepared for a struggle. But Beatrice March did not attempt to flee. She stood very still, framed by the fading light, her posture immaculate, her expression unreadable. She held her gloves in one hand, her coat folded over her arm. Only the faintest tremor at the corner of her mouth betrayed tension. "Inspector," she said smoothly. "Miss Marple, I suspected I'd find you here." "Come inside, Miss March," Bramwell said. "We have questions." She stepped in without protest, closing the door gently behind her. Her gaze flicked briefly to Charles Harrow, then to Amy, but she gave no sign of recognition, no hint that she knew the maid had revealed anything. "I imagine," Beatrice said, settling her gloves on the entry table, "that this concerns Henrietta." "And the candle," Miss Marple added softly. A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed Beatrice's face. Not fear, but annoyance. She disliked miscalculations. "I removed the candle for safekeeping," Beatrice said. "I trust that is not a crime." "No," Miss Marple said. "Removing the candle is not a crime, but using it to measure intervals during the fete, to ensure your impersonation of Henrietta matched the timing you wished to establish, that was part of a murder." Bramwell stepped forward. "Beatrice March, you are under suspicion." She raised a hand, almost dismissive. "Please, Inspector, spare me dramatics. If you are to accuse me of murder, at least present your reasoning properly. I prefer things neatly laid out." Miss Marple met her gaze gently. "Very well." A stillness settled over the room, expectant, electric. "You feared Henrietta would expose your manipulation of the March family records," Miss Marple began. "Perhaps she'd found proof the candle was recast by your hand, not your father's, that you altered its inscription to strengthen your position within the family. Or perhaps the inheritance involved a trust or artifact sensitive to authenticity. Whatever the truth, Henrietta discovered something that threatened you." Beatrice's chin lifted, but she said nothing. "You arranged to meet her in the supply tent at 2:00. The note you left in her coat was meant to summon her. Once Henrietta arrived, you stabbed her quickly, efficiently, then staged the scene with the silver-handled knife." Charles Harrow staggered but did not speak. "You then put on her coat," Miss Marple continued, "took her watch, and walked through the fete grounds. Several saw you, believing it was Henrietta herself. That gave you a false window of time. Meanwhile, the real Henrietta lay hidden." Beatrice's eyes sharpened. "You have no proof." "But we do," Miss Marple said gently, holding up the silver button. "From your coat. Found in Henrietta's study. You were here earlier today, searching. Likely for the notebook. Or for Amy." Amy whimpered again. Beatrice's gaze flicked toward her, a spark of recognition at last. "You frightened the girl when she returned unexpectedly," Miss Marple said. "She saw you place the watch in the drawer, not Henrietta. You realized she had seen too much." Bramwell stepped forward. "Beatrice March, you will come with us now." Beatrice looked at him, then at Miss Marple, a slow, cold appraisal. "You underestimate me," she said softly, "and you overestimate the competence of frightened servants." Miss Marple stood, her voice as gentle as ever. "No, Miss March, I do not underestimate you. I understand you. It is pride that betrays you, not evidence." For the first time, Beatrice's composure cracked. Something fierce flashed in her eyes. Rage, thwarted ambition, perhaps even sorrow. But she did not run. She simply straightened her coat, lifted her chin, and said, "Very well, let us finish this properly." Bramwell escorted her out, the constable joining them as they crossed the path toward the waiting bicycle patrol. When the door closed behind them, silence filled the house once more. Mrs. Fanshawe wept softly in her handkerchief. Amy buried her face in her apron. Charles Harrow sagged into a chair, staring at nothing. Miss Marple returned to her seat and resumed her knitting, as though the world had not tilted. Mrs. Fanshawe looked up, tearful. "Jane, how did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature, dear. It rarely surprises me anymore, only saddens." Outside, the village green lay quiet, the last traces of fate decorations fluttering weakly in the dusk. High Meadow, shaken but still standing, would gossip and grieve and eventually settle back into its gentle rhythms. And Miss Marple, ever observing, ever understanding, continued to knit, each stitch a small meditation on the mysteries of the human heart. The following is the final section of the case of the candle that wouldn't burn out. The village of High Meadow awoke the next morning to the sort of hush that follows a storm, the air thick with the remnants of shock, yet threaded with a strange relief. Word had already spread, as it always did, that Beatrice March had been taken into custody. Some villagers whispered in disbelief, others with vindication, and a few with the grim satisfaction of those who had always suspected ambition beneath Beatrice's polished exterior. Miss Marple slept little. She rarely did after a case reached its culminating chord. Instead, she spent her morning quietly helping Mrs. Fanshawe with breakfast. Eggs, lightly poached, toast buttered, just so, simple tasks that grounded the world again after the upheaval of truth. Bramwell arrived shortly after 9, hat in hand, face weary but resolute. "We've taken Beatrice to the county station," he said once seated in the drawing room. "She alternates between silence and claiming she acted in self-defense. Says Henrietta threatened her." Miss Marple stirred her tea. Pride seldom allows a person to admit the depth of their wrongdoing. Beatrice convinced herself she had no choice but to eliminate Henrietta. Such justifications can grow quite loud in the mind. Bramwell nodded slowly. "There's something else. We found evidence in the March attic. Records Henrietta uncovered showing Beatrice inflated her inheritance claim years ago. Banking documents, altered histories, even a forged appraisal tied to that candle. Henrietta confronted her last week, by the looks of it." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Which explains Beatrice's heightened agitation yesterday. She feared her entire life, her status, her reputation, her authority, would be undone." "And the candle?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A symbol, Inspector, and a tool. Its unusual composition allowed Beatrice to keep time in a way that others would not notice. She used its slow burn to mimic Henrietta's meticulous schedule, ensuring that the sightings of Henrietta matched the timeline she needed. A clever strategy, but cleverness without conscience is only another form of vanity." Bramwell exhaled heavily. "We never would have unraveled it without you." "Oh, I don't know about that," Miss Marple said modestly. "You would have seen it eventually. You have a good mind. It is only that human nature, with all its quiet repetitions, speaks more plainly to those who have spent a lifetime listening." He seemed touched by this, though unsure how to respond, and eventually took his leave with a grateful nod. After he left, Miss Marple stepped out onto the garden path. Birds were beginning their morning chatter, oblivious to the turmoil of the previous days. The village green, still cluttered with remnants of the fete, looked almost peaceful now. Amy Rowntree, pale but recovering, approached timidly from across the lane. When she reached the gate, Miss Marple beckoned her inside. Miss Marple," the girl managed. I wanted to thank you, truly." "There is no need," Miss Marple said warmly. "You showed courage in a frightening moment. That is something to be proud of." Amy blushed fiercely. "I only wish I'd come forward sooner." "That is human," Miss Marple said gently. "Fear clouds truth. It always has. What matters is that you found your strength before it was too late." Amy nodded, eyes shining, and after a few more words, continued on toward the Harrow house, where Mrs. Carston, humbled, subdued, was trying to set things in order. Later that afternoon, Charles Harrow visited Miss Marple to offer somber thanks. He looked years older, yet a strange calm had settled over him. As if he finally understood something about his wife he had never quite grasped before. "Henrietta always believed she could fix the world by sheer force of will," he said quietly. "It cost her dearly in the end, but I think she meant well." "She did," Miss Marple agreed. "Most people do, though good intentions sometimes lead through very thorny hedges." Charles managed a faint smile at that, bowed his head in gratitude, and departed. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat in the garden with her knitting. The air smelled faintly of roses and damp earth. The candle that had stood at the heart of everything now sat locked away at the station, its mysteries no longer dangerous, merely peculiar. Mrs. Fanshawe joined her, holding 2 cups of evening tea. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. "Beatrice March. A murderer. One never truly knows what lies beneath a composed exterior." "One rarely does," Miss Marple agreed. "But there are always patterns, Agatha. People reveal themselves in small ways long before they reveal themselves in large ones." "Still," Mrs. Fanshawe sighed, "it feels like the village is altered." "Perhaps for a time," Miss Marple said softly. "But villages, like people, are resilient. They mend quietly in the background. Soon the fete tent will come down, new gossip will rise, new projects will begin. Peace returns in its own way." "And you, Jane?" Mrs. Fanshawe asked. "Will you stay a bit longer?" Miss Marple smiled, eyes twinkling. "Oh, a few days more, I think. High Meadow has lovely morning walks, and I find a good walk clears the mind after a case." They sat together in companionable silence as evening deepened. Somewhere in the village, a church bell tolled the hour, not slow in winter, not fast in summer, just steady, honest. A welcome sound after the false ticking of a misused watch and a candle that refused to burn down. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Human nature, she thought, would always intrigue her, its vanities, its fears, its small daily triumphs. And though darkness occasionally tested the corners of even the loveliest places, light had a way of returning, and in High Meadow that light felt particularly warm tonight.